This is all making me think that one Sunday in the near future, we should have a day where we all come dressed as ourselves in 1970. I wasn't born yet, so I will come dressed as a twinkle. I would, or at least bring pictures. I want to see you guys when you were jamming out to Peter, Paul, and Mary. Or maybe you're just your arrest record. I don't know. So when I sat down to write the sermon for the week, I had an epiphany. Not a transcendental experience necessarily, mind you, but an epiphany. And it was this. This is the third in a three-part sermon series, as I conceive of it. And it was origin stories, and then destiny, and then transcendence. And destiny was also salvation. And I had in mind a sort of timeline, a trajectory from origin to destiny. So that's a timeline. And it was possible to transcend that timeline to some speculated effect. But the epiphany that I had was that I have these in the wrong order. Originally, I thought transcendence was the ultimate, the trump card and goal. That it would burst through the trajectory of origin to destiny. And so I put it last. But I think that I've learned over the writing of these sermons, and hopefully we've at least discussed together the possibility that an origin story is the creation of now. And now is the only time that salvation is possible. So origin is destiny. They're occurring in the same moment. So there's no linearity to break through. Plus, it turns out that I think that salvation is the final hope. That's where we want to land. Transcendence is not a landing spot. Indeed, I hope to convince you today that, like the origin story, transcendence is a tool for salvation. If you remember, I defined salvation as life free of fear. So like the origin story, transcendence is a tool for living without fear. The origin story is a reflective tool which conditions you for salvation. Transcendence is an experiential tool which prods you on to salvation. And these work together because you reflect on your experience, and your transcendental experience, should you have one, may well become part of your origin story. And then that origin story prepares you for yet another transcendental moment. So these are cyclical. But before we do that, I just want to clarify some terms, and to do that, I'd like to go into history a little bit. Unitarian Universalist history, and also just religious history, or theory. So Unitarian transcendentalism. It was a huge part of our Unitarian tradition, flourished in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and really established a huge part of American culture, for better or worse, and actually for both, better and worse. But it was based on two primary influences, one of which was a German theologian by the name of Friedrich Schleiermacher, which is murder on spell check. And he was writing at the turn of the 19th century, and in Germany, where all of the great theologians were at that time. And he, I think, was reacting to a religion that he perceived had become quite dogmatic, a Christianity that he had perceived had become quite dogmatic and rote. And so he defined religion in terms of feeling. That religion was a feeling that one had. It was based on the individual experience with the divine. And so the Transcendentalists picked up on this. They also picked up on the thinking of a fellow named Swedenborg. And he was writing a little bit earlier in the mid-18th century. He came up with this idea of universal correspondency. By the way, if you think Unitarian Universalism is a hard designation to kind of say, I mean, it's how many syllables is that? Try being a Swedenborgian. You sound like a Muppet. But they are there, and they're actually, I think there's a Swedenborgian church in Tucson, in fact. Anyway, he came up with this idea of universal correspondency, which is where the natural world, everything that you see, is the emanation of God and the spirit world. Bodies are the generation of souls. And thus, all things become signs and powers. Events of nature are divine or demonic communications. So that's pretty interesting. The key concept is correspondency, the merging of the natural world and the spirit world. So then, in America, Unitarian Transcendentalism blossoms. One of its early promoters was a man named Ripley. And he defined Transcendentalism, or Transcendentalists, as people who believe in an order of truths which transcends the sphere of external senses. The leading idea being that the supremacy of mind over matter. Some basic principles of the early Unitarian Transcendentalist was the merger of me and not me. The merger of God and nature, so you could see the Swedenborgian influence. And that this merger must be experienced and felt. So there you see the Schleiermachian influence. So God was in nature and must be felt and experienced directly. And nature, as not me, merges into me. And that also must be experienced and felt. And this is encapsulated quite well in a famous quote from Nature, which was written by Emerson. It's in the first chapter of that pamphlet, Nature, where he says, "Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in blithe air and uplifted into infinite spaces, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." So this may as well have been not creedal, but somewhat close. I mean, it's a statement of faith for the Transcendentalists. I think it encapsulates their thinking quite well. So he was in nature, standing on the bare ground, his head bathed in blithe air. And in that moment, he has this transcendental experience where he becomes part and particle of God. So hopefully you can trace the strains that we had talked about into that sentence. Now, transcendentalism or transcendence is not an exclusively Unitarian experience. In fact, given their penchant for over-intellectualizing everything, there is some irony, at least to my thinking, that transcendentalism became such a Unitarian phenomena. I might wager that few of its promoters actually ever experienced what it was they were promoting. Of course, I don't think that necessarily means they were wrong or even lying. I mean, Moses never reached the promised land and King never saw the beloved community. And if their lack of experience with the experience that they spoke about is cause to ignore them, you should probably ignore me as well. I think that if you were being generous, you could accuse me of having my understanding outpace my experience, particularly in matters of spirit. But then that may be what being a man of faith is all about. Maybe that's what faith is. Maybe. At any rate, it occurs to me that here I am preaching about transcendence without actually ever having had a transcendental moment. I think it will help maybe. Yeah, I'm having one right now. I think maybe we should clarify the term a little bit. Transcendent, transcendence. So Unitarians meant the direct experience of the unity of the spiritual world and the natural world. The direct experience of the unity of me and not me. Have I experienced that? Have you? And there are other terms for this that may help us approach it. So peak experience, the term that Maslow came up with. And he actually did a rather extensive study on people who reported peak experiences, and he came up with 25 features that these experiences tend to have in common. So if you are wondering if you've had one, there's a checklist. But these include feeling that the universe is a unified whole, where everything is accepted and nothing is judged, where egocentrism and goal-striving disappear, a sense of merging with the universe, a sense of altered time and space, of gratitude, awe, love, joy. These are some of those 25 common features. Another common term for a transcendental experience is a religious experience. And in that way, you can see how we as a religion, and how religion in general, has taken it upon itself to foster such experiences. So do we? So more generally, transcendence refers to the transcending of the sense of self. So the next question, of course, has to be, what is the self? And for argument, I would say that the self is a nexus of a web of relationships. Relationships with an idea, relationships with material objects and phenomena, with other beings, your friends, family, strangers, other selves, other nexuses of relationships. So the sense of transcendence is frequently reported as a sense of unity with God or the universe. And unity suggests that two or more become one. So where is the relationship in one? But unity is still a relational word. It implies a relationship because it implies unification with something other. And this actually does become important because if we look to William James, who was an early comparative religious thinker, late 19th century, He found that one of the deepest truths expressed by all religion and people having religious experience is that in the everyday, because the religious experience is something other than, right? So comparing what they said about that experience, he inferred that in the everyday, we experience life as a divided self. If we experience transcendence as a unified sense, then he inferred that we experience life every day as a divided self. And so transcendence is the transcending of the ego self or the unification of the divided self. And the fascinating part is that this is supported currently by the work of UCLA professor Daniel Siegel. He has researched the neurological effects of mindfulness meditation, which is a meditation technique that we touch upon here frequently, in which one pays attention to the activities of the mind and thus becomes aware that the activities of the mind are not the full identity of the individual. So one becomes aware of the divided self and then is able to ideally merge and unify those two selves. So he found that the same circuitry, he's researching this kind of meditation, and he's found that the same circuitry in the brain that activates in social capacities when we're all talking to one another, the part that is firing like mad in my brain right now, is the same circuitry that fires during mindfulness meditation when you are simply observing yourself. So mindfulness meditation becomes a relationship, or at least your brain is perceiving it as a relationship of you to you. And in that relationship is a connection. So from this, I am gathering that transcendence is somehow relational, which is not where I started thinking about it. I thought it was poof, you know, no relation. You are out in the ether. But perhaps transcendence is relational. And this is where the church or the Sangha or the coven or the monastery or any religious community becomes really important. It's a social place. It's a social place that emphasizes ethics and compassion. And so it starts to prep our minds to have a transcendent experience. It's also the place in which one may process and test and integrate transcendent experiences. So when you go out on your hike and you see a hawk soaring through the sky that startles you so much that you are suddenly altering your time and space, experiencing joy and gratitude, checking off the list, you can come back and talk about that here and integrate that story into your narrative. And that becomes crucial. So I'm going to say that transcendence, in a nuts and bolts way, is not the cessation of identity, but rather the radical expansion of identity. It is an expansion of that self, all the networks. It is expanding and connecting on a larger field with more and more relationships. And that feels like unity. That feels like the unity of the divided self, and it feels like the unity or merger or identification of the whole self with an expanded network of relationships. I hope that makes sense to you. I have to do that work for transcendence to have any bona fides. I have to make it make sense to me, and that is how I do that, by saying it is an expansion of identity. And identity expands, ego is left behind, and we ultimately experience a sense of connectedness. Now, have I experienced that? You know what? I have. In fact, many times. And I could say that because I don't think that this is a binary event. I don't think that it's sacred versus mundane experience. I don't think that you're either having a transcendent experience or totally or not. I think there is a transcendental spectrum, at least in my experience. And sometimes my identity expands for a short amount of time, a short distance, if you will, with little lasting effect. And my example for this would be like when I play the ukulele, not for you. When I'm alone and playing the ukulele, my sense of time is altered, my joy and gratitude increase, my sense of space is altered. And then I return. Now, this doesn't change my life. It changes my day, but it doesn't change the trajectory of my life necessarily. And you all, I'm sure, have, for musicians who are very dedicated to music, it might have a greater and longer lasting impact. I clearly am not a musician. But you all have probably experienced similar things when you were dancing ecstatically in 1972. Or if you've been drumming, or any number of things. Sometimes when you're driving. Sometimes when you're singing along to the radio, you have this experience. It's like a minor transcendence. Now, sometimes the experience is much broader, lasts much longer, is much more intense, and has life-changing ramifications. And the best example, the most tangible and common example of this, I imagine, is falling in love. It's a ready metaphor and experience. Passionate love is transcendental. There is a loss of sense of self. There's definitely an alteration of time and space, and priorities, and holy cow, is there joy and gratitude and even awe. So you make decisions in the midst of passionate love that your self-interested self would beat you over the head for making. Question is, which one is thinking the most clearly? So passionate love changes your life. It ends, because it ends, in heartbreak or integration. And they're both very useful, of course. So much like that, transcendence does not last forever. It ends. And you could either have that experience and have it be an experience that doesn't quite change your life, or a radical experience that is a footnote or an addendum, or you can integrate it back into your life and really have it change your life. I mean, you cannot live in the transcendental. There's a great bumper sticker I think I've told you about before that says, "Don't I thou and drive." You cannot be having a transcendental experience. Well, you could be having a transcendental experience while driving, and I hope for everyone's sake that you are not on a major road, that the road is straight, and that the experience is brief. So love, passionate love, is very much a transcendental experience. Or at least you could think about one in terms of the other. So Jonathan Haidt, my very favorite resource, who wrote The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind, he notes that awe is the emotion of transcendence. And he observes that awe occurs when we experience a vastness that cannot be processed easily. I think that love still fits that definition. And the extent to which one can process and integrate that awe, that vastness, back into normal life. And if you'll refer to your order of service, you'll see that we have it broken up from encounter to return. The extent to which the transcendental can contribute to your salvation and your ability to live without fear is contingent upon that integration of the experience into your everyday. So remember, transcendence is an experiential tool for salvation. We could start with 40 breaths. I've got my strings here. They keep falling off, so this is a perpetual event. We could start with 40 breaths. We could practice right speech. Both are exercises of mindfulness. We can gather an intentional, ethical, spiritual, and beloved community. These are exercises in connectivity and compassion and cultivate our self-worth. And then, either on purpose or by accident, we may have a transcendent experience. We may have an expansion of identity. And this community, this network of mindfulness and connectivity will be all the more able to integrate our awe into our narrative so that we become the origin story and destiny that we seek. Guided by compassion, may we find life without fear.